To this morning's or this afternoon's Dean's Research Seminar, and today I'm delighted that we've got Robyn Warner who's going to speak to us. So Robyn completed her Bachelor of Agriculture at La Trobe University and her Master's in Agricultural Sciences at the University of Melbourne, and then her PhD at the University of Wisconsin in Madison. She then worked as a principal research scientist in livestock production systems in the Department of Primary Industries before joining CSIRO as a senior principal research scientist in meat science and the team leader for food and biochemistry. In 2014, she joined the faculty in the University of Melbourne as our professor in meat science. Robyn's been the group leader in animal and meat science since 2017, and since 2019 took on the responsibility of being the domain leader in food science. As well as her position at the University of Melbourne, she's an adjunct professor in the School of Biomolecular and Health Sciences at Griffith University in Queensland and a distinguished professor in the Institute of Food Science and Technology in the Chinese Academy of Agricultural Sciences. With over 20 book chapters, 140 journal publications, an H-index of 38, and research income over the last 10 years as PI of over $7 million, Robyn has an international profile for her work and generates research with impact. In 2014, she received the American Meat Science Association's International Lectureship Award, and in 2010, as part of an interdisciplinary team, the National Eureka Science Prize. Robyn, over to you. Thank you very much.
So thanks, John, for the introduction, and I'm going to be talking about Picture the Perfect Burger. So today I'll talk about alternative forms of protein production and the new protein landscape, some of the consumer lenses for the perfect burger, plant-based products, some cell-based meat aspects, and also labelling, nutrition, sustainability, production, and concept product aspects, as well as finally I'll finish again with the perfect burger. So this presentation arises out of a project called Future Food, Hallmark Project, which is a project funded by the university, and it does research on alternative forms of protein production, and the web link is shown there. So we have 5 themes as shown here, and we also have faculty from 7 different faculties as well as CSIRO involved in this project, and some of the outcomes in this presentation are from our Future Food Hallmark project. So as an introduction to alternative protein, we can think of it in terms of plant-based, insects and cellular agriculture alternatives to animal protein. And this includes insects, plants, algae, cell-based meat, as well as yeasts and bacteria. Now today I'll only be talking about plants, a small amount of algae, and also on cell-based meat. So the new protein landscape, which is on the web, this is from 2018 called version 1.3, and you'll see on the top left, creating new protein. There's a few companies there which are working on plant-based protein and plant-based seafood. And then on the right, you'll see a group of companies which are working on clean protein, as cell-based meat used to be called. So some aspects of clean meat, clean seafood, etc. Now, remembering how many companies are shown in that diagram, now we move forward 2 years to 2020. This is version 2.8. And you'll see now on the far left at the top, we have the cell-based meat companies involved in cell-based meat shown here. And in the middle, we have all of the plant-based companies. And on the right at the top, all of the companies involved in plant-based ingredients. So you see a lot more companies just in 2 years since 2018. And also down here, in terms of research and academia, we have the University of Melbourne identified due to our work in the area of plant and cell-based meat. So the consumer lenses for thinking about the perfect burger. So is it made from meat, is it made from plants, or is it made from cultivated cells? And these lenses can be thought of as quality, health, and credence. So the consumer often, and very understandably in terms of climate change, thinks about sustainability. They're concerned, some of the consumers are concerned to be assured that the food is GMO-free. The flavour and texture needs to be certainly very good for them to want to keep eating the product. nutrition and health are important aspects of as a lens, and finally, animal welfare. I'll be discussing all of these topics in this presentation except for animal welfare. So first off, starting off with plant-based alternatives for protein. So what's available in Australia, and this is the first one that I came across when we had the Global Table Industry Conference last year, which was in Melbourne for the first time. And this product was launched at Global Table in 2019. It's by a company called Sunfed. It's called chicken-free chicken, as shown here. And it's actually made in New Zealand, so it has only 6 ingredients in this case, with the main ingredient being pea protein. So this picture in the middle shows some of the product at the back and some actual chicken fillet at the front. And the Choice magazine taste test with consumers, one person said it was not horrible, it reminds me of cardboard. But another person said, I like it, similar to a chicken nugget, tastes somewhat like chicken, but quite dry and overcooked. Chicken should be juicy. Now, what's interesting is when the company was launching this product at this conference, they're doing a lot of taste tests and cooking it up, and they're always cooking it in lots of oil. And I think this is because it does tend to be, and some of these products do tend to be dry. And so by cooking in oil, they're able to add in flavour and also juiciness. One final note, I do apologise, is the price is there. So 36.7 per kilogram is quite expensive. There's also the Impossible Burger, which has been produced in the USA. So this product has 20 ingredients, which includes coconut oil, which is in the future going to be replaced due to the high saturated fat content of coconut oil. Importantly, it also has a compound called soy leg hemoglobin. So this is to replace the need for heme protein, which is normally in meat. This product is not available in Australia. Leg hemoglobin is presently being assessed by FSANZ, Food Standards Australia and New Zealand, for eligibility as a food ingredient. And the US Centre for Food Safety originally requested the recall of this product due to the genetically engineered leg hemoglobin content. But the FDA clearly stated that it was safe to eat. And interestingly enough, in this case, the retail cost of the Impossible Burger is 4 times that of a ground beef burger in the USA. So several more products on the shelves in terms of the perfect burger. And now we're thinking about the cooking, taste and texture. So we have done some taste tests with some of these products. And one of my PhD students purchased the Beyond Meat burger, which is also made in the USA, from 21 ingredients, and its main ingredient is pea protein. There's also Funky Fields minced plant-based mince, which is made in Denmark, and this one has 16 ingredients, with the main ingredient being soya protein and about $20 per kilogram. So what we did was we actually prepared burgers from each of these 2 products from the shelves, supermarket shelves, and also prepared some lamb mince, which in this case just had 1 ingredient, lamb, which had been minced up and made into a patty. So there were differences in the visual colour, and just as a point of interest, these 2 do look relatively pink, the Beyond Meat burger and the plant-based mince, compared to the V2 mince, which is a new product on the shelves in the supermarkets, which has made no attempt to look either red or pink, but is actually quite brown in this picture here. So there's differences in the visual colour. The lamb mince is this red colour, whereas the Funky Fields is a bit brown, as is the Beyond Meat burger. And then when you cook the product, there are differences in the browning. So again, this is the lamb mince, and you can see some of the myoglobin is still red in the centre in this case while it's cooking, but you do have some really nice maillard reaction and browning on the surface, which gives a lovely taste. Certainly some browning for the Beyond Meat burger, but not much browning at all happening for the Funky Fields burger. And there was also some differences in flavour and texture. So as you'd expect, the lamb mince tasted really nice, really juicy, had a great flavour. The Beyond Meat burger was relatively pretty good for texture, actually. It was simulating the meat texture pretty well. The flavour wasn't too bad, but it wasn't great. But certainly the Funky Fields minced burger had quite a cardboard taste, and the texture wasn't very good. So there was differences in the flavour and the texture. And this is This is significant challenges in the plant-based food industry to try to simulate the texture and flavour of meat, which is research that we were doing. So we were meant to run a consumer taste panel test this year with consumers, but of course with COVID-19 we weren't able to do that, and so I'll now just report some results from other papers. So in terms of the, I'll just show you results from 2 studies. There was variation between experiments and also between products. So what's shown here is the consumer liking score for products under what's called a blind or informed conditions. And this was done in the Netherlands. In their study, they actually compared meat-based, plant-based and insect-based, but I've left the insect results out of this slide here. So you see blind means they don't know what the product is, and half of them are given the product blind, and then the other half are given it informed, and then they come back and they reverse that. The ones who had it blind then get it informed. Informed means they're told what the product is based on. So for the meat-based product compared to the plant-based product, you'll see that basically the people who eat the meat-based product blind, they preferred the product, 6.45 versus 4.72, which is the comparison. And when they're informed, reasonably equivalent in this case for the meat-based and the plant-based. So again, still the meat-based was preferred over the plant-based. The 2 highest sensory terms selected were juicy and meat flavour as being very acceptable, whereas for plant-based, the 2 highest sensory terms selected from the list were off flavour and aftertaste. Now it's interesting to compare that to a study that was conducted in Italy. So the first one was in the Netherlands, this one's in Italy. And again, this is consumer liking scores for products under blind or informed conditions. In this case, they had a beef burger, a pea protein burger and an animal. The way they labelled it was animal-like protein burger, which I know was actually what's called, the impossible burger. So when they're served blind, you'll see that the preferred burger in this case is the animal-like protein, the impossible burger. Next most liked is the beef burger, and the pea protein burger is the lowest. But when they're informed, informed that it's actually a beef burger, the liking for the beef burger is actually higher than when it was blind. And similarly, for the animal-like burger, it was higher, whereas for the pea burger, it was actually exactly the same. Now, with this study, I think they probably cooked these burgers, the beef burgers, for too long, because it's quite unusual to hear for a burger that it's actually dry. And in the case of the beef burger, what was disliked by some people was the dry filling to it and also the texture, but they liked the meat-like and the taste. Interestingly enough, for the pea protein burger, some people thought the taste and texture was good, and some people actually disliked the taste and texture. So certainly the Impossible Burger came up with pretty good scores in this case. So the global market for meat alternatives in 2019 was 3.3 billion globally, so that's pretty high. In USA, it's certainly a very fast-growing industry, and it grew 11.4%. Top products are Beyond Meat, which is in Australia, Impossible Foods and other products shown there. In Europe, the top products are Corn, which is in Australia, Plant Power and several other ones. So in Australia, there's certainly a growing market in the plant-based alternatives with 14 companies, last I heard, involved in this. So the products, in terms of on the supermarket shelves, in my supermarket, the space, this is actually the space in the chilled area. So it's actually a very, very small space in the supermarket relative to the whole chilled meats area. And what's shown here is some of the products that are made in Australia, beef, golden falafel, etc. There's also a number of products on the shelves in the supermarkets which actually are imported from Malaysia, Netherlands, New Zealand, etc. Now, for all of the products on the shelves, none of them were made from 100% Australian ingredients. And what this emphasises is that Australia really needs to increase the production of the crops for these plant-based products. But we also need to increase the processing capacity around Australia. This was the whole driver for the Pulse protein CRC, which didn't go to stage 2, unfortunately, which we found out in the last couple of weeks, but we will be reapplying next year because of this very big need for production and processing. So now I'll talk about cell-based meat. What and why? So cell-based meat production is meat made from stem cells, which mimics traditional meat without the animal. And it's aligned to cellular agriculture, the production of agricultural products from cell cultures rather than from whole plants or animals. And Business Wire has calculated that the global cell-based meat market is projected to reach US $593 million by 2023, so a really rapidly growing area. Now, last year until about October last year, the industry was called a clean meats industry by those who were involved with the companies. They've now changed their name to either cell-based meat or cultivated or cultured meat because clean meat was never going to be accepted generally by the industry. This diagram here shows the 45 companies around the world involved in some form of cell-based meat, and importantly, you've got various countries which have industries, including Israel. USA has 19 companies shown in the middle, all the ones in the middle here. And the companies with the blue line around them are those who formed an alliance of 5 companies so they can actually work together on the regulation and labelling aspects of cell-based meat, which has been successful. We also have, since the last 2 years, 2 companies now in Australia, Vow and Huros, working on aspects of cell-based meat. So what is this process of cell-based meat production? We've actually been we've been culturing cells, in fact neural cells, since the late 1800s was the very first culture of cells. And in the 1930s, Winston Churchill said, we shall escape the absurdity of growing a whole chicken in order to produce chicken meat, and we'll be growing it from cells. So yes, we've been culturing muscle cells for a number of years, and that's shown in this top diagram here. So in the future, because it's not actually available on the shelves yet, although certainly the technology is there, it's going through regulation and labelling, we'll be able to take a very small biopsy, 0.5 grams from an animal, put it through a bioreactor, which is shown here, which is how they envisage actually growing these cells up, like a sort of bioreactor that you might actually ferment beer in. And then these muscle cells are cultured up and then taken right through to cells which can be harvested. Some additives might be added, and a 0.5 gram biopsy is enough to make 80,000 burger patties, according to Mark Post in the link down the bottom. So we think there'll be product on the shelves in the next year or two in terms of actually making these patties. So because we're only able to culture muscle cells by themselves at the moment, it's only possible to make a burger or a patty or maybe a sausage. You can't actually make a whole steak. Now, in the long-term future, the hope is that as we develop this technology and learn more, that you'll be able to co-culture muscle cells, fat cells, connective tissue cells and endothelial cells to make a whole steak. But certainly at this stage, this is very aspirational and easily could be in more than 10 or 20 years' time to make a whole steak. So there is a number of challenges to developing, some of the challenges to cell-based meat production one is developing cell lines. So you need to develop cell lines so you can have a limitless supply of these cells. So basically you take what are called stem cells, and what you require is what's called a pluripotent stem cells. That means it can develop into a fat cell or a muscle cell or an endothelial cell or connective tissue cell. And you also want those stem cells to be able to limitlessly divide, not have a limited lifespan, and you want them to be able to be easy to culture, easy to proliferate, and also to differentiate. So this picture here shows a muscle fibre or a muscle cell which is multinucleate, and the satellite cells sit on the outside of the muscle cell. And these satellite cells coming from a mature animal only have a certain number of divisions that they can go through. So it's about 25 to 53 divisions, and unfortunately these satellite cells from muscle cells are the classic ones that we culture muscle cells from. And that's the most simple procedure. to derive starting cells for cell culture. But due to this limited division capacity of these cells, the research is really around how do we develop a pluripotent stem cell line with limitless divisions. Oh, sorry, the other thing on this is that you need to refine the process for every species. It's not just develop a process for one species and then you're done. Another challenge is that in terms of muscle cell culture, you need growth factors, you need stimulation, you need an extracellular matrix or connective tissue for the cells to grow on, otherwise they won't grow. That's moving by itself, very strange. And also you need stiffness. So this diagram here shows the how when you start with the satellite or stem cells, it then is able to, you want to proliferate and then become a myoblast, which is differentiation, and then form into an early myotube and then into a mature myotube or almost a muscle cell. And for that process to occur, you need various growth factors, as well as you need stiffness, mechanical stimulation, and extracellular matrix proteins. All of these are quite complex to provide in a cell culture medium. Of course, all of this naturally occurs in the muscle, in the animal's muscle. And another challenge is that in terms of culturing the cells is that they need something called growth media. So the growth media provides the nutrients for them to grow. The classical media has buffers, vitamins, but it also has serum or blood from animals, which provides the growth factors. And usually, in terms of culture, you do need antibiotics at about 1%. So the cell-based media for the future scale-up of cell-based meat production has to be animal-free, which we think is now achievable. We need to substantially reduce the cost of growth factors, which is occurring, and there's research going on that. And ideally, there should be no need for antibiotics. So the challenge in terms of the cost of the growth media is because animal-free media is 55 to 95% of the production cost is in the growth media, and 99% of that is due to these growth factors. So the burger that Mark Post made in 2013, and there's a lot of publicity around this, and it was fed to people and was all big exclamation about it, that cost 2.9 million Australian dollars per kilogram to produce. By 2018, that had reduced down to $31,000 per kilogram. And now, this year, it's come down to $3,000 per kilogram. So coming down very significantly over the years. Future estimates for animal-free media vary from $4 to $50 per kilogram. Now, due to the cost of the media, Just, which is one of the companies, is using fillers. So usually the companies making products only put about 10 to 20% of muscle cells into the product. But Mark Post certainly advises against this as not a good way to go for making these products. So to summarise some of the challenges in the scale-up and the priorities of the present research in cell-based meat, there's a need for scaffolds, which are the connective tissue matrix for the cells to grow on. There's a need for development of pluripotent cell lines, which have limitless divisions, and this needs to be developed for each species. So it might be beef, cow, chicken, even kangaroo, and certainly for seafood. There's also a need for research on the growth media for proliferation and differentiation. So the growth media has to be optimised for every different species in terms of the cultivation. So we need an alternative source of growth hormone, cost-effective animal serum-free, antibiotic-free and GM-free, because some of these stem cells which have been produced, which are pluripotent, are actually produced through GMO. There's also research needed on bioreactor design and filtering and recycling of media, because there's a lot of water involved in the culturing of these cells. So finally, there is public and consumer health and food safety aspects to this. So there's perceived positive outcomes of a shift to cell-based meat, where we might have a reduced use of antibiotics, which are obviously very important for community health, reduced transmission of disease, and reduced incidence of foodborne disease outbreaks. So now moving forward to some of the data from the Future Food Hallmark, the project. So here I've actually asked for slides from my colleagues, and they've provided some slides for me to show to you. So firstly, in terms of the nutrition claims, this is provided by Georgi, so Georgi Skrinis and Jennifer Lacey-Nichols, and they actually did a study looking at all the nutrition claims on the plant-based meat analogues. So some of the primary nutrition claims, including claims around protein. So they should be high in protein, so the label said high in protein, or they might say pea protein. Another primary nutrition claim was plant-based, as well as free from, so it might be gluten-free, soya-free, or GMO-free. Some of the nutrition issues and debates include the following. So they state that they're simulating the nutritional profile of meat, or are they, such as protein? So are these products improving on the nutritional profile of meat? For example, are they reducing saturated fat? Now, in case of the Impossible Burger, by adding coconut oil, which quite a few of these products do, you actually maybe got a higher level of saturated fat than you would desire. Or are some of these products inferior to meat in terms of nutritional profile? Another aspect is the processing and additives that are involved in making these products. So some of them are ultra-processed, and that can be contrasted with some of the minimally processed foods. So are plant-based products are they replacing whole meat, or are they replacing processed meats? And what about minimally processed legumes? These don't seem to be getting a very high profile on the supermarket shelves, and there's certainly potential for these to maybe highlight it more as being an alternative. Furthermore, there appears to be a lack of transparency on some of the ingredients and additives. So other food system issues that they identified in their study was some of the food labelling regulations. So there is sometimes a conflict between stakeholders over the terms meat and also milk. Now, if we're always trying to make plant protein products that are simulating meat, are we perpetuating the taste for meat? So people will still continually want to eat meat-like products rather than reducing the taste for meat. So that's one concept that's really important. A lot of these products, in fact, all of them are really heavily packaged. So are we promoting packaged and convenience foods? And obviously the aspects to that are packaging, the nutritional quality of those products, as well as the cost. And finally, the corporate concentration of the protein market. So there are certainly a few large companies start to dominate the market for the protein products. Now I'd like to move forward to some of the regulatory study aspects. So this is Christine Parker from our law school and Hope Johnson from QUT. And they had an analysis of the laws and regulatory process regarding technical risk assessment of these novel proteins, permitted food descriptors, nutritional claims, and also the environmental and ethical claims. So they looked at the qualitative analysis of submissions to Food Standards Australia and New Zealand regarding this compound called soy leg hemoglobin. So over 60 submissions to FSANZ were coded, and they looked at the response to an application from Impossible Foods to FSANZ where they wanted to amend the Food Standards Code in order to sell products containing the GM soy leg hemoglobin as a nutritive substance. So going forward to their preliminary findings, under the current regulatory regime, meat analogues can use meat terms such as burger or sausage, provided the label clearly states or indicates that it's not meat per se. Plant-based analogues like the Impossible Burger are intended as a substitute for meat, but they can be voluntarily fortified to align with the primary food. They can claim a product as a good source of iron, but they cannot claim the product as being a dietary alternative to eating meat. The environmental, ethical, and broader health claims on novel proteins will likely be dealt with under the legal regime for misleading advertising. So this is where consumer law and especially the ACCC comes in that aspect. And some of the future responses might be likely that a new regulatory regime is needed for cell-based products, and it's fairly likely that future regulatory reforms will make specific labelling requirements for all meat analogues. So now moving forward to the nutrition and health aspects. And this is an interesting headline from The Age and also some articles from the SBS. So why meat-free could damage your health was one article. And on the right, we had a leading nutritionist, Dr. Nick Fuller, was from Sydney University, claiming that some plant-based meats may have hidden health risks. Some fake meats have heavy manufacturing. They may have added fat and definitely added salt. And he was recommending that plant-based burgers should only be consumed once per week. So Anita Lawrence provided some information here, and she's involved in the Hallmark. And so in terms of health and nutrition, her question was, what if we replace beef, or beef burger is replaced by plant products and plant-based burger patties? So she's involved in doing some scenario modelling using results from the most recent National Nutrition Survey, should be 2011, I think, to 2020 or 2019. So the average consumption of red meat by Australians was 565 grams per week from this study, which is 24% higher than Australian dietary guidelines. And we also know that Australians are the highest consumers of meat in the world on a per capita basis, and we're equivalent to USA. So what if some of the mince, sausages and burgers Australians usually eat become plant-based? What are the nutritional implications? And will Australians miss out on some important nutrients? Or will their diets become closer to the recommendations? So this is the work that Anita's undertaking at the moment. Doesn't have her final results yet, but because in the lack of the final results, she then went to a paper that was listed in Nutrients, MGPI Nutrients, and looked at the data coming out of this study. And it was comparing plant-based meat substitutes. So the plant-based products were found to be generally lower in energy, lower in total and saturated fat, and higher in carbohydrates, sugars, and dietary fibre than meat. They were not generally lower in sodium. They were variable in iron, zinc, and vitamin B12, and only about 1 in 4 or 5 were fortified. And they were certainly lower in protein. So overall, the study found that the products lacked equivalence with similar meat products. So now moving on to sustainability in terms of Australia and relative to the world. So Australia shown in the 2 top graphs is in red. We are amongst the world's top 20 emitters of greenhouse gas emissions. But in fact, if we do it on a per capita basis, we in fact are very high per capita basis for our GHG greenhouse gas emissions. Down the bottom, this shows from the Department of Environment and Energy where Australians' emissions are predicted to be coming from, such as agriculture, transport, burning fuels and electricity are all contributing. But importantly for this presentation, will plant or cultivated cell-based protein production become the solution for agriculture? So some of the sustainability claims by companies shown here are for the Impossible Foods. They claim that they use 87% less water, less land, fewer GHGs and less water pollution. Similarly, Beyond Meat claims less water, less land, fewer GHGs, as well as less energy. Now, what's not included in these analyses, they're conducted by the companies, so they're not, obviously they are biased. What's not included is carbon sequestration in pastures where animals are grazing, water scarcity, for example, because Australia, in fact, has water scarcity. Peas and soybeans, for example, have a much higher water use than the meat species in Australian conditions. What's not included also is biodiversity. So there's obviously a need for independent assessments of sustainability of these products under the Australian environment. So our colleague, Brad Ridout, is involved in the Hallmark, and he's been publishing on these aspects of sustainability and diet. So they took data from 2011 to 2013 Australian Health Survey and then took it apart and analysed for the percent, and they looked at the various quantities and groups. Got a lot of work involved in this study. And the percent contribution of each food group, so the food groups are shown over here in the Australian Guide to Healthy Eating, to total greenhouse gas emissions. What I find really interesting in this graph is that, yes, certainly meat and alternatives are high for greenhouse gas emissions, so sitting around just under 35% contribution of the total. That's red meat, poultry, fish and veg alternatives. But in fact, discretionary foods, which are things like processed meat, burgers, tacos, alcohol, sweet biscuits, are also very high in greenhouse gas emissions relative to the other categories shown here. So certainly this concept that we should really be reducing our discretionary consumption as well as our meat consumption in order to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So moving on now to sustainability of cell-based meat, though there's a few different studies that have been conducted around the world, and this one is from Mattock in USA. So they looked at industrial energy usage as well as the global warming potential. And they were using, really reporting this in vitro, this study here. So for energy usage, in fact, in vitro or cell-based meat is thought to be quite high in energy usage, but a lot of high standard deviation around that as well, but certainly higher overall in terms of the mean, than beef, and much higher than pork and poultry. For global warming potential, certainly the mean was lower than pork and poultry. Sorry, it was higher than pork and poultry, but lower than beef. But importantly for these analyses, this one and other ones done in different countries around the world, there are a number of assumptions that are made in doing this modelling. There's uncertainty because there's no commercial production of cell-based meat yet. So it's very hard to be definitive or conclusive. In fact, Mattock concluded in a later paper that really in terms of the energy usage, until we decarbonise energy, that cell-based meat would not be better for the environment in terms of sustainability. So certainly ongoing data collection is required here. Finally, in terms of algae, so Greg Martin is working in our project on cultivating algal cells. And normally we get the very important nutrients DHA and EPA either from fish when we consume it, but it's also extracted out and put into tablets and used as ingredients in food processing. So the cultivating of algae, as shown here, has the potential to prevent the need for harvesting DHA and EPA from wild fish. So we see this cultivating of algal cells as a potential source of a healthy ingredient for burgers, etc. For example, in adding it to blended products, plant-based products, or to cultivated cells. So the alternative sources of protein and the proof of concept products that we are developing is shown here. So we're certainly working on algae production, as I just mentioned. One of the PhD students is working on plant-based yogurts, that's Matali. We're also working on blended animal-plant products, as shown here. This is a student called Xin Yu. And finally, we're just starting off 2 new students in their PhDs on cell-based meat. Other aspects that we're investigating are the flavour of heme proteins. How important are heme proteins for flavour? How can we improve the texture of these blended meat products? Developing animal-free serum as well as scaffolds, which we're working on with engineering. So we've certainly got some plant-based products on the left here, sausages, burgers and nuggets, which are trying to be meat. But there is recognition that there's an incredible range of vegetarian options in many cultures, as shown here, falafels, Indian spinach curry and stir-fried tofu. So there is certainly a precedence for a number of vegetarian options around the world from different cultures. So finally, in terms of which is the best burger, well, certainly the beef burger is juicy, thought to be juicy and tasty, culturally acceptable by many. It is satiating, has good nutrients, but there is no need for carbon neutral strategies in Australia. And we do need to reduce the consumption of meat in Australia. And we need more data on the sustainability under Australian systems. So for the plant-based burger, there's been a big increase in products. Some of them are quite ultra-processed with many ingredients. There's been a lot of new product development with more R&D required for Australian production on farms and also processing. There has been big improvements in taste and texture, but that's still needed. And we also need Australian data on sustainability. Finally, for the cultivated cell products, the production will be in the future. There is big potential for Australia. Otherwise, we're likely to be importing cell-based products. So investment is needed by government. Consumer acceptance, some will accept it, and some won't. But certainly the sustainability at this stage is uncertain, but more data again is needed. And finally, in recognition of my colleague, Mark Potter, who says basically, which is the best burger? It's actually all in the sauce. I'd like to just acknowledge my colleagues who are involved in helping to prepare these slides shown here. And now this is open for questions.
Thank you, Robyn. That was great. Thanks very much. I have a few questions, but can I encourage everybody to put questions in the Q&A, not in the chat, but put them in the Q&A box. Robyn, maybe I can start while people are thinking about questions. You did mention a number of different sources, different ways of making meat there, be it from plants or algae, which are obviously a kind of plant system. And then you also mentioned insects. Now, in some areas of the world, and I spent at one point in my career quite a bit of time in Africa, you can go out and you can catch the flies and you can pat them down into a patty, and the people around Lake Victoria eat these black flies that they make into patties at a certain time of the year, and it's very nutritious and they look forward to that time of the year. But how acceptable is it, do you think, to Western societies and, for example, our Australian culture if we were to make patties and burgers from fly proteins?
Yeah, well, there's been a fair bit of study done, as you may or may not know, John, on insects. So some cultures, as you said, are very accepting of eating insects, and I think people who want to try something different are willing to try it. Sometimes these insect products are actually ground up. So a person who was working with me from Chile was actually making these really nice little cookies with insect flour. So the insect in the product can actually be pretty well disguised. And I think from my reading and certainly that paper where they had an insect product, there's two aspects to it. One was that you don't want to see the insect sticking out of the product. That turns people off eating it if they're not used to eating it. But also, what was the other aspect? So that some of the insect products were a bit crumbly and probably weren't as acceptable in flavour. Is it the same protein as meat protein? Well, no. So there might need to be some changes to extract out the shell, for example. So increasing consumption around the world, a lot of interest. Insects are also very good for as an animal feed, as you may or may not know, John. So they have potential as an animal feed also.
Yeah. Okay, thanks. Let me ask you another question, and that is about your cell-based meat. And as somebody that has in my career done a lot of tissue culture, you showed us those great big, what I would call cell factories that are making the cell-based meat. So you get these pluripotent stem cells, or you get these satellite muscle cells, and you grow them up, and they form what, single monolayers of cells, or they actually pile up and become quite thick. I mean, what do you harvest out of there? Are you actually just harvesting a single cell layer, or are they cells in suspension and then you put them all together, or are they actually quite thick mat of cells that you can that have some texture to them?
Yeah, so it can only be about 2 to 3 cells thick. You can't get any thicker than that because otherwise the nutrients don't get into, obviously feed the muscle cells. So Aleph Farms in Israel claims to have made a 2 to 3 millimetre thick steak. And we've actually talked to some of these companies around the world, including Aleph Farms and the companies in Australia, about working with them. A lot of interest in Australia in cell-based meat from companies that are presently making animal products. So, yeah, they're only about 2 cells thick at this stage because otherwise you have no blood supply, and so you can't actually get the nutrients to come in and the waste products to be taken away if you go more than 2 to 3 cells thick.
And if I follow that line of thinking, Robyn, I must say I'm feeling a bit sceptical at the moment about whether this is ever going to be a way of producing lots of meat and lots of burger when I see all those cell factories lined up and all that tissue culture fluid and the cost sometimes of the factors that you have to add to tissue culture. For example, the recombinant. Well, that was my question. Are the growth factors recombinant, for example, or do they have to be actually isolated from animal tissues? So when you put these growth factors in to turn it into meat cells or myotubules, have you actually got recombinant growth factors that are being used here that are relatively cheap, or is this a very expensive thing?
So some of the growth factors are recombinant, which is what they're trying to get away from, because if they have recombinant growth factors, people won't want to buy the product if it's being used in production. So the big challenge is to do the research on producing the recombinant factors. So the best way at this stage to do it, obviously, is still to use the serum, which we know will be successful. a lot of investment around the world in this space. So I think there's no question that a product will come to market. What price it will be and how acceptable it will be is the other question. It might be a niche product. So for those who are very interested in, eating meat products that are maybe more sustainable, they might buy it. So the challenge is, and so these companies all have a lot of information within in-house, but it's really they don't tend to divulge or share that. So the research did start off in universities, but now it's very much with a lot of those companies I showed you around the world. Some of it is recombinant, yep. The challenge is to find ones that aren't recombinant, of course, including the stem cells as well, which can be engineered to go backwards from a, say, muscle satellite cell backwards to a stem cell. But that, again, takes genetic engineering, which is not always acceptable.
So it seems like that might be quite a long way off, at least cell-based meat, at least to mass produce it.
Well, it's interesting because if you read the articles coming out from the companies, one of them claimed they'd have product by the end of 2018 on the shelves. So the limitation at the moment would be around the regulation, and there's been agreement on regulation in terms of who's managing it in USA between FDA and USDA and how they're going to proceed forward. There's been some good movement forward in the USA. Similarly, in Singapore, there's been movement forward in terms of the regulation, and they're probably not as regulated, not going down as much of a regulated path, for example, as USA is. So there's been really significant progress, I'd say, in the last 6 months even, as opposed to a year ago. Yeah.
Okay. Robyn, we've got questions from colleagues now, and I'll start with Kate Howell. Kate, do you want to ask your question?
Hi. Yes, thank you for that really interesting presentation, Robyn. I was just wondering, is it possible to incorporate fat cells or a fat structure within the cultured meat to improve the the taste and the texture and the similarity to meat?
Sure. Yeah, thanks for the question, Kate. So at the moment, they can't. Every cell that's been cultured needs to be optimised for its cultivation. So it's, as you understand, different. In the animal, the biology and biochemistry just does it and it works, whereas when you're culturing these cells, the fat cells need different culturing conditions to what the muscle cells need, and similarly the connective tissue cells need different culturing conditions. So at the moment, as far as I know, they're not co-culturing, but the aspiration for the future, yes, they would be co-cultured. So you probably cultured muscle cells in one bioreactor, fat cells in another bioreactor, and then maybe combine them together for a product, or you've got the product and you add some fat in. So at the moment, co-culturing doesn't seem to be feasible, but it certainly will happen.
Okay. Caitlin Pfeiffer, would you like to ask your question? Caitlin, go ahead.
Hi, thank you. Robyn, thank you very much for the presentation. Really interesting stuff. One of the Sustainable Development Goals is to end hunger, and specifically they tend to refer to that as regular access to safe, nutritious and sufficient food, and there's 2 billion people in the world who do not have that at present. Do these meat alternatives have any relevance to low and middle income countries where hunger and food security really is an issue? Or are they mostly only relevant to high-income countries like Australia?
Oh, great question, Caitlin. And we had this big debate in our Future Food Hallmark project. Are we trying to feed the world? Are we developing a niche product? So we decided to include both. So I see potential for some of these products to really help to provide more protein for the world at a reasonable cost. Some of that, probably with the cell-based meat, some of that is very, I think that's more of a niche product than helping us to feed the world. And what we have to remember is that in terms of nutrition in developing countries, young children until they're about 3 or 5 years old, really need animal products for their brains to develop. And then later on in the Western countries, we eat too much meat and protein, I think. But so it's very important that people in these developing countries, the children actually have access to some form of animal food in order for their brains to develop properly. Very important. Hope that answers it,
Thank you very
Caitlin.
much.
Next question would be from Vern Bowles. Vern, are you there? Vern? Your microphone should work, Vern. No? Okay.
No. Can you hear me now?
Okay. Yeah, we can hear you.
Sorry about that, guys.
No
Yeah, thanks, Robyn. I was just interested in your talk about, you mentioned beef and you obviously mentioned the chicken tasting things. I was just wondering about other species. Is anybody looking at, and I don't know if you mentioned it, but, lamb, turkey, other species, fish, for example?
Yeah. Good question again. So certainly beef and poultry and pork have certainly been cultured. I think Vow in Sydney, the company in Sydney, has been looking at some of the more exotic species. They've been doing kangaroo, for example. The seafood, the interesting thing about fish mussel is that it doesn't have that. The culturing seems to be more straightforward because it doesn't have that problem with limited divisions with the satellite cells. So, in fact, fish mussel is quite different. And I personally see a lot of opportunity with seafood, and the Good Food Institute in USA also sees the need for more R&D in the seafood mussel cell culturing. So in Singapore, Shiok Meats is actually culturing seafood. So basically you can culture anything, but you have to optimise the growing conditions for each one. But I see seafood, rather than plundering our oceans and harvesting all of the fish, I think the concept of being able to culture fish mussel cells is pretty promising, and we're hoping to get funding from the Good Food Institute in that area as well.
Okay, no worries, thanks.
Okay, the next question I've got on my list says anonymous attendee, so I won't open the microphone. I will just read it. And the question is, are there any studies being developed to substitute serum for growing cell-based meats?
Yes, yes, there are, definitely.
You're going to have to grow it in fetal calf serum or something, are you?
Sorry, is it a question of animal-free media? Is that the question?
Yeah, correct, yeah.
Yeah, no, definitely. That's the big race around the world. In fact, Huros, who are based in Brisbane in Australia, are working on an animal-free media. So we've been talking to them about doing some testing with their product. So that's when I did my review, which I published last year, I didn't think there was any successful animal-free media being used around the world according to the papers, but I was corrected by my reviewers that there was, one reviewer said there definitely was success. The other reviewer said definitely hadn't been any success. So I think there is animal-free media out there that's been being used successfully for proliferation, but you still need to add these growth proteins in order to allow differentiation.
Okay, thanks, Robyn. The next question comes from Rosita Spirovska. Rosita, would you like to ask your question?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yep.
So, Robyn, just wondering on the progress of developing scaffolds for cell-based meat and how similar they are into connective tissue in meat.
Oh, yeah. So the scaffold area, again, is really interesting, and we want to work with Andrea O'Connor in engineering, who's, there's obviously a great application of biomedical technology and the making of what's it called, limbs and all that sort of stuff. So how similar is it? We actually have talked to a company over in Western Australia who's developed I don't know what it's made of now. Min could tell me. So they've developed what they think is a successful scaffold. So the question with the scaffold is, do you want to be able to eat the scaffold? So if you do, you've got to think about what you make it from. So ideally, cells need to grow on something. They don't just grow. They always want to, when they're proliferating and differentiating, they need to attach onto something. So as soon as they start to attach and join, they will differentiate. So they do need to attach to something. And in vitro, they attach down onto the Petri dish, and you coat it with something to help them to attach. But the question is, what can we make the scaffold from? So ideally, it might be edible. So you actually, it becomes part of the product at the end. So there's a variety of options that are being developed around the world. And the concept, normally the cells attach onto the Petri dish, but what we think is the best thing in the bioreactor is actually if you've got these free-floating, like a star-shaped thing that the cells attach onto, so you've got this agitation in the water and they're growing and they're floating, would be the ideal situation for the growth in the bioreactor. But that's where some of the R&D is going on. So a variety of ways to make the scaffolds for them to attach onto.
Thanks.
Okay, 2 more questions and then I think we call it for a day. So the next one comes from Chiara Murgia. Chiara, are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
Hi, Chiara.
Yeah, hi. Thanks, Robyn. Really interesting talk. And I just have a nutrition question about the macronutrients bioavailability from plant-based and cell culture alternative meat. I'm thinking about micronutrients such zinc or iron that have a much better bioavailability and they're actually inhibited by plant components. So do we have data on the bioavailability of those micronutrients?
Oh, good question. I see you as the nutritionist. So I'd love to have you involved in the project to help us answer some of those questions. There is data out there. So yes, there's anti-nutrients and phytates and tannins in some of these plant protein products which inhibit some of the micronutrients from being taken up. And so the challenge with, for example, in the proposed pulse protein CRC is to process the pulses enough that we render those phytates or anti-nutrients and not able to be active when in the actual final food. So that it does have to have attention to it, and they do vary in some of those. So yeah, there's certainly a consideration of that. The other interesting thing that I've heard about is how in the gut, the peptides in meat actually grab onto heme iron and then really enable the uptake of not only heme iron, but they might also grab onto non-heme iron from maybe the plant products. So if you've got some iron coming in the plant material that's being digested, but those peptides might also grab onto that and help in the uptake of the iron from heme and non-heme iron. So what are those peptides, which my colleague in Argentina is investigating? Be interesting to work out what those peptides are, that maybe we could even add them into some of these plant protein products to help in the uptake of the non-heme iron, because that's quite an issue, certainly in some of these products. Cell-based meat, you can sort of engineer the micronutrients to be whatever you want it to be. So plus or minus iron and zinc, it's vitamin B12, etc.
Thanks.
Okay, and the last question that I had actually is not so much a question, but is really in praise of vegetarian burgers from Aaron Hughes. I'm gonna skip that in the interest of time. But Aaron, thanks for the comment, and I want to finish now not least because I have to go to a meeting with the Vice Chancellor and the other deans, and I'm going to be late. But Robyn, thank you so much for that overview, and good luck to you and your colleagues in the Hallmark Institute, which seems to be coming along nicely. So great. Thank you very much.
Thanks, John, and thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye now.